Boards are expected to understand the diversity and complexity of these risks as also their damage potential. The panel will discuss all this and whether enough is being done to keep corporates reasonably safe. If I could request our panelists to please come up on stage, Ms. Shikha Sharma, Mr. Sunil Alagh, and Mr. Subramanian Sarma. Please be seated, ladies and gentlemen. I'll introduce our panelists to you. Ms. Shikha Sharma, former Managing Director and CEO of Axis Bank, is presently on the boards of several large companies. She began her career with ICICI, where she was chosen to head the life insurance division. In 2009, she joined Axis Bank as MD and CEO to focus on strengthening its retail lending franchise, enlarging its investment banking and advisory capabilities, and developing a comprehensive portfolio of products. Ms. Sharma has more than 3 decades of experience in the financial sector. Hers is an impeccable track record of building successful and enduring businesses, a deep understanding of business through data and analytics, and the ability to build businesses based on consumer insight and technology execution. Mr. Sunil Alagh, former Managing Director and CEO of Britannia Industries, is the chairman of SKA Advisors, a business advisory consultancy firm focusing on marketing and brand building strategies. He has 4 decades of hands-on experience and has developed and incubated several successful brands. Mr. Alagh held various senior positions in the private and public sectors, working with ITC, Jagajit Industries, and Britannia Industries. His rich experience in multiple stakeholder management helps him mentor leading executives battling with business objectives amidst conflicting personal objectives, fractured governance, and challenging needs for succession planning. He sits on the boards of some big companies. Mr. Subramanian Sarma is the whole-time Director and Senior Executive Vice President Energy at Larsen and Toubro Limited. During his career span, Mr. Sarma has handled the complete oil and gas value chain, including executive management, business development, project management, and process engineering. He's the person overseeing the risk function in L&T, India's largest infrastructure group. L&T's hydrocarbon business rose from the depths to great heights under his stewardship. To moderate this panel, I'd like to request Ms. Shikha Sharma.
Thank you. So I think all of us come with quite different experiences and backgrounds, and I thought I'll just start with maybe some of the key risks that I've experienced in my life in financial services, and then I'm probably going to hand it over to Mr. Sharma to talk about his experience with large project management and complexities around that. And then Sunil, who probably has the most colorful stories to tell us about his experience with a lot of consumer sector companies. So mine is the most boring, and that's why I thought I'll start first. That in banking, we are kind of generalists, so we try to know a little bit about all sectors and don't have enough depth around any, which is why it's good to get these 2 experts to come in later and talk about their specific sectors. But the key risks that we talk about and have probably developed expertise on over the years, most importantly, of course, is financial risk. So whether it's credit risk, liquidity risk, forex risk, all of those have been topics of risk management in financial institutions for a very long time, and there's a whole amount of literature in terms of around the metrics, putting your risk appetite in place, putting controls in place, and trying to manage to the financial risk. Despite that, of course, we do have situations of failure, but I think financial risk hasn't been the biggest problem for financial institutions. It's some of the other risks which don't get anticipated and measured so well, which actually end up creating problems. And to that, I'll talk about two specifically. Operational risk. I think in the previous panel, they talked a little bit about operational risk. And what do I mean by operational risk is fundamentally around execution. So, you know, how you define your processes, whether there's process compliance, whether employees are doing the things they need to do, and what goes wrong when something anticipated happens there, because ultimately you cannot program people and they will do what they have to do. Sometimes, again, because we are generalists and we're not experts in a sector, and we are expected to finance all sectors, we do end up with unanticipated situations. So if I look at my experience with Axis Bank, or even in ICICI actually, when we do project financing, the problem that arose was when we started out, the world was a lot more predictable, there was a lot more structure. This was 40 years ago when I started in financial services sector. And as we went along, the world has become more unpredictable. Changes are beginning to happen much more frequently, whether those are policy changes, regulatory changes, or just environment changes, all of which come and impact different sectors. And not anticipating some of those changes what has created risk, which then translates into financial risk, but it doesn't start there. So for example, if I look at Axis or ICICI or any of the large institutions who played a part in infrastructure financing, you know, we made some assumptions. We made some assumptions on what was customary in the way business was done. And you assume that a project would be awarded and the environmental clearances will come through and the project will happen. Or you assume that if the licenses were given for mining or whatever, that it was a good assumption to make, that those licenses will exist and that supply will come to you. But in many of these projects, what happened was environment clearances took forever. That delayed the projects, that created cost escalation, and there was no way to pass on that cost escalation. And that in turn ended up creating financial risk for the institutions. In hindsight, it looks you should have thought about it, but at the point that we were doing it, you thought that was business as usual and went on. And similarly, the coal mines got cancelled, and that had a disastrous effect on a lot of power projects. The second risk, you know, again from an operational perspective that I want to talk about is for banking with deep distribution, ultimately the front line does a lot of the interfacing. And so if somebody makes an error of judgment at the front line and does not escalate it early enough, that can create a disastrous situation for the company. And I'll talk about one of those later, which can be an operational risk and create reputation issues for the institution as well. And if I look at just through my career, you know, okay, we started in a period of a lot more certainty when I started 40 years ago. By the time I became CEO of ICICI Prudential, which was about 20 years ago, there was a lot of uncertainty creeping into the environment. Today, when I look at bankers and what they have to do, it's a really tough environment because there's so little you can take for granted, that ultimately your ability to respond becomes more important than your ability to identify and manage. Of course, those two are important, but I think the response part becomes the most critical. So before I hand it over to Mr. Sharma, I'm just going to give one example of a small error of judgment that one of our branches made when I was leading ICICI Prudential and the kind of ruckus that created. So, you know, the life insurance industry, selling happens through agents, and it happens in other sectors as well, I think in the FMCG and pharma sector and many others, that you run contests for your sales team to motivate them to do well on the sales side. So a lot of the contests used to be designed centrally, but there were some budgets for the branches to do their own contests. And one of our branches in UP decided to run a contest where he was trying to be very imaginative and colorful, and you know, the contest was called "Who is going to be the next Osama bin Laden, who will kill the maximum number of policies?" You know, he thought he was being very cute about this, and he hung up posters of guns in the office. And somebody came along, saw that, and was wondering what was happened, and I think went and spoke to the police guys, and the police came to the branch, and this guy got scared, and he shut down the shutters, and he burnt the paper guns that he had over there. And then it became a bigger issue, and a police case was filed, and the guy was arrested, and then it came up for discussion in the Lucknow Assembly. And, you know, as a young manager, my dream was that one day you want to be famous, you want to be known, and ICICI Prudential did get known. It became masthead news in Times of India for all the wrong reasons, and then we had to deal with all the aftermath of explaining how it was innocent stupidity on the part of that branch manager which created all of this. And then, you end up putting more controls, but just ultimately I think it's about managing your people and culture and being able to respond quickly when an issue like that happens, and encouraging people that when something goes wrong, don't try and bury it, bring it up, ask for help, and try and respond as quickly as you can. So I just wanted to talk about those two things. That financial risk, yes, important, but you can put metrics around that. But some of the operational risks, some of the reputation risks, and more recently in operational cybersecurity risk, is where you get a lot of unknowns. You get a lot of known unknowns, and you get a whole lot of unknown unknowns, and learning to manage and respond to that is an art form today. With that, I'm going to hand it over to Mr. Sharma to talk more about, he obviously has a lot more expertise on large projects and the kinds of things that L&T might have faced.
Thank you, Shikha, for sharing your experience. I think for me, being in the last session, the biggest risk is to keep the audience engaged. I'm quite sure Sunil is going to do that with some colorful stories. I think I work for L&T, and as you know, L&T's biggest part of the business is in the project business, infrastructure as well as energy. Of course, we have manufacturing and services, but the large part of the risk and large part of our revenue comes from the project business. Now, within the project business, there are several types of risk. Just to name the few, most of our contracts, what we undertake, be it for government or be it for private or be it for international customer, is mostly fixed time, fixed price contracts. So that means we are sort of, giving them a fixed timeline and agreeing to a fixed timeline and giving them a fixed price. So when you do those jobs, when you undertake those contracts, we are subjected to market volatility. Today, and particularly in this last 18 months, I've been giving a lot of sleepless nights to us because the volatility in the market, the disruptions, what we have seen post-COVID and then the post-war era, the fluctuations in currencies, these are something which are very, very difficult to manage, and we need to constantly manage. The second type of risk what we come up with is the change management during the execution. No matter how well the contract is defined and the specifications are attached, but there is always an interpretation issue, and then there are preferences, and customer always want to see certain way, and we haven't costed for it. So that becomes a bit of a dispute in the execution stage. And there are, of course, statutory approvals, be it in the domestic, dealing with central state, or dealing with foreign countries where we have constantly changing regulatory framework, the visas requirement, the labor component you can have, the diversity you need to have, etc., etc. We have to cope up with those kind of changes. And of course, also we have weather-related, sometimes because we are working on a fixed time, so extended monsoon or extended hot weather in the Middle East, that poses us a problem because we allow for some time, but not for those unexpected events. And biggest risk, of course, and I think we all face it, regardless of the industry, is the skill availability and the talent availability, and particularly in the blue-collared space, which is very migratory in nature, and we need to keep developing those and also induct them to require not only the technical skills but also the safety skills. So these are the kind of gamut of risk we need to cope up with. Some of them can be managed internally, by ourselves. Some we need to engage with customers. Some we need to go beyond customers also to manage with stakeholders. I will take 3 examples just to sort of demonstrate the process of managing those or mitigating those. One of them is, let me start with the internal one. We do a lot of work for oil and gas projects in offshore. For ONGC is our main customers, and build a lot of platforms there. And at any point in time, it's seasonal. I think offshore work in the west coast of India is done between November to maybe end of May. And after that, there is a blackout period because of the monsoon season. You can't operate in that monsoon season. So we have a specified window, and we deploy a huge number of assets. I mean, just last year, we had about 85, 90 marine assets. And just to give you a feel, the cost of running those assets is about $1.5 million to $2 million a day. That's the scale of operation. And we have weather windows, and we keep monitoring it. And any unexpected, when the weather gets worse because of either storm or wind speed or tidal waves, then we need to interrupt, which is a lot of money. So we allow for a certain amount of time. But last year was a very, very unique thing, is that sometime in April, the weather forecasting agencies started saying that there's going to be a likely storm, which was very unexpected. And a storm might hit, and the eye of the storm could come to Bombay High West. And 15th of May was the time when you are supposed to complete. And if you don't complete it, we have to go back next season, and it's a lot of money, for us to mobilize, demobilize. And we were watching very closely. The forecast was changing, and 7th or 8th of May, I still remember, we felt that the storm is going to hit, and we took a very bold decision to withdraw all the assets back to the coast, because we had about 2,000 people working. At that point in time, the financial consequence was low on priority. The safety of our people, 2,000 people, was the most important, because that would have led to a reputational damage. So we took that bold decision. We got all of our staff and our assets safely to the coast. Very unfortunately, the storm hit, and that was, you would have seen in the paper, there were major accidents, and about 85 people lost their lives. And that was a judgment error, like you talked about, a judgment error, whether we should, it's a very difficult one, because every day costs you 2 million, and if you come back and you have to spend huge amount of money to do the same job. But at some point in time, you have to take those decisions, informed decisions, based on what is important to you at that point in time. And for us at that time, safety of our assets, safety of our people was nothing paramount, and we took that decision. That's just one example, which was totally internal. It had nothing to do with customers or nothing to do with the stakeholders. Another example what I have is more on the international project, is related to where the customer was involved, and that was also after the COVID-19 situation, when the oil prices collapsed, and everybody was struggling. And then the customer said that, listen, with this prices, I cannot. We had already a contract, a large contract, $2 billion, and we are really ramping up. He said, I can't fund it now, because prices have come down. I want to slow down. I will tell you what I can pay every month bill, and you need to readjust your pace and schedule according to that cash flow I can afford. And which means a lot of idling and a lot of assets getting not fully utilized. And he gave us the choice of termination. But I think one important point he made is that, please don't exercise the option of termination. Continue with us. We all are facing this problem. When the good days come, we will try to help you. And we went by that. We took that advice. We stayed on. Fortunately, oil prices went up. And trust me, I think on his own, without us asking, he came and gave us a compensation. That's a kind of a risk-sharing model, where, you balance the risk. You and that is the kind of partnership model we should have more and more, because some of the things are, beyond everyone's control. And I think good times and bad times, you need to balance it out and even it out by having some kind of a risk-sharing model. The third one, I would say, is a stakeholder-related thing, where we had a partnership again, for a very large international project. We had two of those, actually. One is the Mumbai Metro, and then one again an offshore project in the international, where the partner, who had a very specific expertise, during the course of execution, went down belly up, and then he filed for Chapter 11 in US and left us in a lurch. So I think that is a counterparty risk we need to manage. Not only we need to step in, we have to step in, but we need to balance the whole process. And there actually required huge amount of skill, because on one hand, we had to keep the customer happy. We had to keep the project going, because counterparty risk is ours. We didn't want the customer to get sensitized or take any drastic action. So we had to keep the project team focused on the execution, and we had a parallel team working on how to mitigate this risk which has come because of the counterparty, which required dealing with codes and dealing with coming up with an alternative plans, exercising some of the step-in rights. So I think all of that took 6-9 months, but finally emerged, and I think we came out of it quite well. So these are the type of risk and different ways of managing them, and it is very situational based. So I think the point what Shikha made is, I think as an organization we can always find ways and the knowledge and expertise to build it. I think what is most important is the right culture. I mean, the culture of transparency, culture of openness, no blame culture, and when the situation arises, I think you have to lead from the example and drive it from the top for the bigger risk, so that there's a full inclusiveness in the whole management process. And these are my thoughts.
With that, Sunil who's probably going to tell us the most colorful stories about his experience.
See, I am a Punjabi. My mother was a Sardar, so ex-Sardarni, so don't expect any thought-provoking speech from me. Because we Punjabis are known, when you leave a thought with them, when you see them again, they will give it back to you saying you left something behind. But as I was born and brought up in Calcutta, so I have the freedom of speaking about Bengalis also. Never leave a thought with a Bengali, because he'll make a philosophy out of it. So therefore, I am just going to talk about the fact that, look, I was telling my colleagues that, look, we Indians are absolutely great in solving problems, but we are very poor in facing them. Like that's where the risk is. The risk is that none of us anticipate what is going to happen, and we are great that when it happens, how do we solve it? And that's when the team gets together. But we can easily have avoided it, and that's what the situation is. That, look, there's a new group of leaders emerging, all in their 40s. We are the old lot, and therefore we have to understand that maybe we have solved problems in certain ways, and maybe successfully so, but is there another way of solving it? That's what we need to look at today, and that's what the situation is in terms of risks that we face. See, we have to become from task-oriented to people-oriented. That's what consumers are all about, and that's what people are all about in organizations. Look, I mean, it's important that we look at things where we, it's not just we have to move from a rule-bound society to doing what is right. Because very, very often in companies you find we are operating within the rules. That's fine. In fact, chairman of the audit committee, I've been on some audit committees, and we are all operating within rules. But doing what is right becomes most important, and that's the big risk in the room, where the elephant lies in the room, is that are we doing what is right? That's what's important in life. And if we are not doing what is right and we are doing what is rule-bound, that is the society that we are in, then we've got a major problem coming up in the next 5 years and 10 years. When we talk about transparency, we talk about various things, but those are never followed. For instance, take for example when Maggie faced the problem, and there was one small guy in UP said something is wrong with Maggie, and most of the guys in Delhi said, oh, it's a small guy in UP, don't worry about it. They lost 50% of the sales when they didn't respond to it. So what technology teaches you, how to respond immediately to any problem. That's the big risk that we face, because it's taken them so many years to get the sales back in Maggie. And therefore, it's very, very important that we follow the Black Swan event. Look, what Tata Consultancy Services, TCS, I'm giving that example in Chennai, has taught us is that, look, when the tsunami took place, there was in Star News, which was part of the Tata Group, they woke up 1 week later and asked Tata Consultancy Services whether we can be of any help to you. What they didn't realize is that Tata Consultancy Services had written down a book on planning for this Black Swan event. They had moved in the very next morning in terms of taking care of the people, doing whatever there is. So the question of dealing with a Black Swan event like a war with Ukraine or doing with COVID, you have to have a book. When I met Dhirubhai many years ago, Dhirubhai Ambani, that is, I was just a marketing manager in Britannia at that time, and I asked him, and he said, look, there are 3 things which are, I don't even know whether the Ambani group follows that rule or not, but he followed it to the T when he said there are 3 things, there's birth, there's death, and there's marriage. Therefore, he had put into a policy in the company that everybody at a certain level, that is, you will be below you, if you are talking about, maybe he had worked out at that time 2,000 rupees. And then as you went up senior, and senior, you asked for 5,000, 10,000. You had to buy a gift as soon as you saw there was a birth. You went in and said, hello, how are you? And only person that you were involved with was the people below. That's all. And then the people above you were involved with you. So when there was a death, when there was a birth, when there was a marriage, he had people going across, and that's how he built an atmosphere where you move from task-oriented to people-oriented. And therefore, no matter what risk we talk about, whether you're black swan or any kind of risk, if you are not backing the people, as you said correctly, if you're not backing your people and if you're not training your people to deal with risks, I think you're running a bigger problem than any problem in the world, as far as I'm concerned. So therefore, you have to have new ideas to solutions which you have done before, but there may be technology now says to deal with it, and you have to have a rule book which says not just for gathering dust in a drawer or something. You have to get into saying, like the Maggi noodles thing, or the entire story which we are talking about, where people are able to act instantly to any risk that there exists. And therefore, you talk about an elephant in the room, fine, but many people don't know what to do when they are faced with the risk. For instance, I was a chairman of a risk management committee, and that company used a lot of water. Now, you know, in about 10 years, there's going to be a water shortage in India. There's going to be a water shortage in about 15 years. Therefore, one of the risks that was faced was, is the water shortage going to be imminent? Therefore, what are you doing about it? Therefore, you came up with policies which everybody was involved in, how to replace water and how do you get more water coming out. And therefore, that's a risk which you know about. But there are many unknown risks which, as you said correctly, but if you write a book and write a rule book, as he said, there's a birth, there's a death, there's this thing, and therefore you have to go out and deal with it, or you do a TCS system. And therefore that's very, very important. Most of us stare around saying when something befalls us, and we say, now what do we do? That's out of the question now. I mean, ultimately at the end of the day, therefore you need good mentorship. What I call mentorship in managing a risk is that how do you mentor people below you, and how do you get mentored by people above you, and therefore each level needs to deal with it. Because see, leadership is something which is not only coming from on top. Leadership is something which you have to, a salesman is a leader, the sales manager is a leader of salesman is a leader of someone else. You know, there's this old story of, I don't even know whether I should tell, but I think everybody is adults. But there's a story of an Indian two managers and their secretary, an English two managers and a secretary, and the Americans, two managers and a secretary, both of them taking a flight to a conference like this. And sure enough, the plane doesn't crash, but they have to force land, and they are in the middle of nowhere. And when they are in the middle of nowhere and they cannot contact anyone, the Americans get fed up of each other, and finally they shoot the secretary and they live happily ever after. And the British, being a little better than the Americans, keep on saying, we got to share the secretary, therefore on Mondays you have him, on Tuesdays I'll have him. And the Indians are still waiting for instructions from head office. But as far as we are concerned, we have to have leadership which is at each level to deal with the risks. Because it's very easy to say, oh, there's a risk, there's a risk management, and there's elephant in the room and everything else. I've been chairman, I've been on different audit committees, as Mr. Damodran has expressed, and there were people who were talking about it earlier. Look, the role of an independent director is to ask the right questions. You have to rely on the management to respond. But if you don't ask the questions, then you're exposed. And therefore, the role of the audit committee is to ask the right questions. And if you ask the right questions and the management says we are dealing with it, fine. But if the management itself is shocked and you're shocked, then you better look into it yourself. And therefore, the audit committee becomes very important when you talk about, somebody asked about, there is a rule which says that look, the audit committee must approve any transaction which is related party. Okay. So the committee brings all related transactions, whether it's an uncle, an aunt, it doesn't prohibit anything. What is the role of the audit committee is to ask the right questions. Is it being done at a rate which is possible, which is the market rate? You're not doing any favors. Are you doing it at the right way? Now look, you rely on management. What else can an independent director do other than that? But if you don't ask the right questions, you're running a big risk as the audit committee itself. And therefore it becomes very important, and I've been part of the audit committee which has gone into such lengths when we had to do it, that look, we have, and then you say we'll sack the manager concerned. If he's giving you the wrong answer, if he's lying, if he's doing something which is not right, then sack him. But independent directors cannot do anything more than that.
Thank you. So maybe I'm going to just ask one quick question and then I'm going to open it to the audience for questions. So Mr. Sharma, in your industry, what do you think is the most undermanaged risk or the most, not enough focus is being given on that risk right now, if you had to look forward?
Well, I think, if you want to broadly classify the risk, we talked about known, known unknown, and unknown risk. I think it shifts depending upon how much knowledge you have, because everything can become known if you have the knowledge about it. And I think old institutions like L&T is 8 decades old, 8 years of existence. There is so much of knowledge. We have come across maybe all types of risk, what you can think of at some point in time or the other. So as an organization, that knowledge exists, but as an individual currently who is running those projects, does he have that knowledge? That's where the gap comes. And that for him it becomes unknown, but for an organization it is a known risk. So I think for me, the maximum focus has to be that how do we disseminate this knowledge as quickly as possible across the breadth and depth of the organization. And I think technology can be a great tool here, because we have now wonderful technologies and we should use those technology to accelerate that dissemination, so that the level of knowledge what exists in the organization is quite widely distributed, so that by itself will minimize the risk.
Thank you. Sunil, in your industry, which is the risk that you think companies are not paying enough attention to and should be thinking about looking 10 years forward?
What we are not paying enough attention to is we have to divide by saying what does the organization want, and if you're working, what does the government want, what do the employees want, and what does the consumer want. Now, it's very difficult for us to say that, look, you can turn around and say, look, what the organization wants is to work within the law. What the government wants is to work within the law. What the consumer wants is something totally new, as far as he's concerned. Okay, they don't care about governments, they don't care about anyone else, and therefore the risk lies in the consumer industry on not only your image and your reputation. What does the consumer think about you? What does he think about the product? And there lies the risk in terms of not dealing with it instantly. When I say instantly, it means if consumers are feeling something, by react with them tomorrow morning. Do not take too long. And therefore, that is something which almost everyone does. So therefore, I am just coming back and turning around and saying, what do we want? You cannot operate within the law. For instance, advertising now. I'll just give you ads which are appearing. We don't want the government to interfere in ads. But Advertising Association of India looks at, are you within the law? Yes or no? Are you advertising alcohol in the name of saying, I'm playing cards or X or Y and all that, whatever you call it. Now, if you're doing that, and if people are complaining, the consumer will start complaining, the ones who are against alcohol and all that. Once they complain to the government, and the government is forced to take action. So you have to avoid that risk by stopping the advertising yourself. That's what you should do, because otherwise, sooner or later, the government will come out with another law and another law. As somebody said, there'll be so many laws, and then when you are combining everything together, then you're working, and you very rarely are we thinking of doing what is right. That's what's important. You must do what is right and not what is within the law.
Thank you. So with that, should I open it up to the audience for questions? Yes, please.
So my question is for Mr. Sarma. I was keen to know in L&T, how do you really deal with the land risk, land acquisition risk for new projects? Because like we know, even if the land is government acquired, the Supreme Court might come and say pay the differential after 10 years. And in case of private land acquisition for more and more projects, we are seeing agitation by farmers who have really accepted the deal in the first place. So that was my first question to you. And the second question generally to the panelists, we are all talking about ESG, but while we handle it in the longer term, in the short term, if your assets are spread out throughout the country, how do you really deal with the climate change risk? Because you don't know when it impacts which asset. And really today I feel, at least personally, the only tool we have or the mitigant we have is insurance, which is not really adequate to cover anything. Forget about the loss of availability or the output, but also monetarily it is not adequate to compensate for the physical asset loss really.
Want me to start? Yeah. I think the first one, it's a very, very sort of valid risk, and we face that almost most of our linear projects. I mean, I call linear projects are the projects where we have roadways or rail tracks, freight corridors, and then also pipelines, where it running across various districts or across the country. Now there are different ways. I mean, I think you cannot be completely avoided. Let me start with that, because there is always be some risk, but there are several ways you can mitigate. I think having experienced this and having gone through that learning process, as an industry, as a community, I mean contractors community, and even governments have, authorities are well aware. What we are trying to do first thing is a lot of advocacy that before the tender comes out, that the authorities try to get land acquisition done as much as possible. I think now the recent tenders, the government themselves are claiming that 80% of the land or 90% of the land is acquired, and then only they let the tender out, which is a very positive development to mitigate. Two is, of course, that you have to build that certain amount of disruption in your planning, and most of these linear jobs, you'll have to build that flexibility of how you manage your spreads. I mean, you have to sort of keep yourself, in terms of assets and people, certain flexibility that you can leave certain part of it, move on wherever the land is available. And there is a cost associated with that. You have to build that in cost. I mean, you have to be realistic about it, build in that in cost. And third, of course, is a very, very, informal way of engaging with the local communities. And you need to have a strong kind of PR machinery working with the community there to try to sort of, I mean, both can run concurrently. I mean, they can continue to have their issues dealt with the authorities. Meanwhile, the work can also progress. But these are the 2 or 3 ways I think we can deal with the problem.
You want to talk to ESG as well?
Well, I think maybe you can start. I'll come back on that.
On ESG, do you want to talk to that question?
No, she's asked a question, he's answered it.
She had 2 questions. She had one question on land acquisition and the other on ESG risk. How do you manage ESG risk? You did talk about water and how you thought about water proactively and started planning for water. But did you have any other thoughts around ESG?
I really, because it all varies, depends upon which industry you're in. And for instance, another industry that I was in, what if another state this goes dry? Then what happens? Your business might be completely affected by it. So you have to prepare for that risk. Not all India is not going to go dry, and Bihar has gone suddenly dry, for instance, after Gujarat. Now the question remains that were you planning for Bihar going dry, or did you set up a factory in Bihar, now you're stuck with it? So that becomes the risk management which you have to deal with. And you must always be aware that in case the government does it, then you must be aware of it, because as I said, what does the government want? What does the organization want? What do the people want? That's how I would define my risk. See, the consumer taste and behavior is changing everywhere. In India today, the younger generation and the older generation, they differ in taste. So when I'm selling biscuits, one of the biggest risks is that Will the same brands work or not in the next 5 to 10 years? Will the same taste work or not? So you have to be aware, otherwise you will be left high and dry. You might be number one. Parleys was never number one. Britannia was number one, but today Parleys have become number one, whether you like it or not, because they have been coming up with more and more products than anyone else. But that's a risk which, depending on the industry, you must look at risks outside what is the obvious ones. You must look at risks which are outside what you think are the obvious risks. And that's what's important.
So actually, just through my experience in banking and then now being on a couple of boards, I think ESG was very esoteric even 5 years ago. But today I'm seeing people a lot more conscious about it and specific about what to do on ESG. So, one of our board members actually, when I was in Axis Bank, had pushed us to come up with an ESG policy. And we started, very tentatively and said for projects above 500 crores, we will do an ESG evaluation before we go ahead and finance that project. Now, to be honest, we did it because we were being pushed by the board to do it. But if you looked at it practically, it made a lot of sense, because when you thought about the ESG element, you were actually reducing the risk on the project, because the chances of pushback from a regulator or a policy maker or from communities reduced if we were ESG sensitive. So it was actually a good forward-looking policy that was put in place thanks to one passionate board member pushing it, and it was about more than 5 years ago actually. But if I look at the boards that I sit on today, some of them are actually taking this and converting it into an opportunity, because they're thinking ahead and they're being conscious on ESG issues. They're actually getting a competitive advantage on B2B business. So on winning projects, on becoming a supplier of a particular product in a bulk-to-bulk sale, their ESG credentials are helping them win. I also think that, Sunil's been talking about consumers changing, right? So as consumers become more health conscious, more safety conscious, you just have to prepare for that future and say that the world is changing, and how will you make sure that your product fits that changing need as we go along. I don't know if that answered the question, but let's take some more. Yes, please.
My question to the panel is, you talked that the rate at which changes are happening, it is more and more frequent. A lot is talked about knowledge, experience, skill sets, but there are new technologies coming up, new business model, first of its kind. So how do we manage the risk in these kind of disruptions which are happening in the marketplace?
Well, I think maybe you want to take me today.
Yeah.
Anil is a colleague of mine, so anyway. But I think you... They say insider trading. But the technology disruption caused by technology is something which you are going to face it more and more, and it cannot be avoided again. I think what we briefly spoke about is anticipation. I think that's where the answer lies. Is that in your own sphere of work or offerings, you have to have a good amount of intelligence network working to tell you what kind of technologies are being developed or being thought through. And I think that's not that difficult, because there is so much of a network of venture capitalists and private equities who are all sort of approaching this technology through those sources. You can at least get a good understanding of what kind of technologies are being pursued and at what stage those technologies are advanced, how far they are advanced, and then you need to sort of correlate that to what kind of disruption it could cause and readjust your business model. I think that's the only way I think we can deal with that, because you can't stop that technology is being developed. That's somebody's freedom, and he'll exercise that freedom. That's the way I see it.
No, I think the question that you've asked amongst consumers is that, look, as far as I'm concerned, when my father was alive, when he said something, that was it. Whether we agreed or disagreed, whether he was wrong or not, we never argued with him. My children have grown up now, and the only thing that I've learned is to keep the communication going. Because it's much better for them to talk to you than to go and talk to the neighbor or the uncle. Now the next generation is not talking to anyone, they're talking to the phone. So the question is for you to become alive to it. That's all. Therefore, if you're stuck with your ideas, and therefore you're solving all the problems the way you solved it or the way your father solved it, you're heading for trouble. Because I always say that the same problem could be solved another way now. And there's a new task, and there's a new resolution, and there's the same problem though. But if you're not alive to it, then the risk is not just an elephant, it becomes the tiger, it becomes a zoo. And then it becomes very difficult for you to manage. So it's a question of you trying to stay alive, because to all the changes that you can possibly, it's not that every single change that is possible to change with, but you have to be alive to it. I mean, the younger if you've got grandchildren, talk to them and you'll find out what they are talking about, and what are they looking at. And therefore, consumer taste, consumer behavior, everything is changing for us in the consumer product, in the FMCG business at least.
So yeah, one of the things that I learned from one of my previous bosses was there is, and it's been one of my favorite statements, that the pace of change only increases every year. And that's what I've seen, and that's why I think it becomes more and more difficult to manage, because we are not seeing any of that mean reversion theory that people talked about. I don't think we are seeing mean reversion anymore. We are only seeing faster and faster change happening. So how do you learn, and how do you make learning a key skill becomes important? So for a lot of our leadership evaluation, I used to always say that learning agility is the most important element we're looking for in people. And I think Sunil talked to that you can't be stuck in the ways of yesterday. You have to be willing to learn, and learn from anybody. And as I said, one of my previous bosses, he would go out and spend, I think, 30% of his time talking to people outside our industry and learning from them on what are they doing, what are they thinking about, because you're then talking to a non-competitor, and they're a lot more open about talking about what's going on in their head, and you get cross-industry learning. So that's something that we used to find pretty valuable. I don't know whether that makes sense in your sector. Yeah, please.
So I have a question. More often than not in corporates, we assess the risks which are there, like you said, visible risk, and some may even go beyond and they do risk mitigation, etc., etc. But we don't focus on the risk of not taking enough risks. Yeah, and I think that's something we completely miss out, and then people live in their cocoon that it's all managed, it's safe environment, but not taking enough risk is becoming a bigger risk in itself, depending on how people around you are moving, whether consumers or competition or the market. So how do you propose, what should be the approach on this, which is missed out in most of the risk metrics of the corporates?
A good question that you've asked, but not taking enough risk comes from the top. Huh? That's not something will come from below. So if you're top management, if you're an owner-driven company, then it comes from the owner. If you're a professionally run company, then if one CEO is not taking it, you hope that he moves before the next guy takes it. And I'm presuming that every CEO has about 3 years when he's either moved out or moved up or moved out of the organization. But it's important that risk on top, you must learn how to take. You're not something which is given. For instance, when we launched Tiger biscuits, it was against glucose and it was against Parle glucose, just to give you an example. The risk was taken by me when I was CEO. Now, you learn how to take that risk, and if something goes wrong with Tiger, then you're to blame.
Buck stops there.
And therefore, you must learn within your own organization. I've told the entire team that, look, you go out and sell it. My job is to convince the board that it's there. But if I wasn't capable of taking it, then they had to wait till I moved out, and somebody else comes in. But it has to come from on top, those kind of risks, not taking a risk and all that. Or the owner, when you had Birlas and all, they were into cement, they were into X, they were into Y. They took into all the industries. They were willing to take the risk. Today you are saying get back to your core, and therefore you will not go into areas which are not yours. So it all, as time moves on, the risk that you take is there, you know, and stop taking the risk on your children. That's very important for owner-driven companies. That look, I mean, as one of the companies which I was involved in, they asked him that, look, do you want to hand over your company to your children or do you want to make more money? And they said, we want to make more money, in which case your children will make more money. But if you want to hand over to your children, then it's up to you. So that's the question which has to be
just to add, I think progress means taking risk. Otherwise you are stagnating. I mean, that's the way I see it, because I mean, not taking risk is really stagnation. And like Sunil said, it also depends upon where that person who is the decision maker is in his life journey. I mean, at what point in time. So because I'll just give you an example. We are sort of having a partnership discussion with one of the Middle Eastern entrepreneur who has been very, very successful. I mean, he was, now I think his age is around 65, 70, maybe close to 70. But he has been a self-made man and he built a very good sort of business. And when we are going and having a discussion with him, he wants to join hands with us, he wants to grow, but at the same time, he has certain perception about certain elements of risk which he wants to pass it on to us. I said, that doesn't work. I mean, if you are together, we have to have a equal share of risk and reward. I mean, you can't choose that the most risky part I will not take and less risky part I will keep it for sharing. Why that psychology is that because he says, I have been very successful, I have acquired a lot of wealth, now I created a lot of wealth. I don't want to risk that wealth because I want to now secure that. But that mindset happens, you know, people who are starting like startups, they have nothing to lose, so they take more risk. But people who have achieved something, they go into this protection mode and they want to protect what they have created. I think that shift happens. So very important that the board and the organization, if it is like a promoter driven, I think he will continue, in my view, I think he will continue to take that risk because by nature he is an entrepreneur. But if sometimes you have non-promoter driven and people have accomplished and then there is a risk of losing, I mean the fear of losing makes them more conservative. That is the time when change has to happen because that is good for the organization. That's my view.
Yeah, so let me actually just add to not very different but maybe slightly different dimension. So I had the opportunity to work in ICICI when I started my career, and ICICI built a lot of businesses, and I think fundamentally we did that because we had risk appetite. It was a successful institution but it still had risk appetite. And if I think about why did it have risk appetite and why were we able to take risk, because fundamentally you were not punished for failure. And if something went wrong, and I remember as a very young officer, I think I'd spent 4 years in the bank at that. It was actually a financial institution at that point. At that time, things were not automated. This was 45 years ago, and all loan agreements, commitments, disbursements used to happen through passage of paper. And I remember I ended up in a situation where we did a double disbursement on a particular loan. And I happened to be going through the files and I realized, oh my God, we've done a double disbursement. And I went to my boss's boss and told them that, look, this is what's happened. We've ended up doing a double disbursement. And he did not yell, he did not frown, there was no crease on his forehead. He said, okay, mistakes happen, now go and see how you can recover that money. And in that particular case, it was a happy situation. We did manage to recover the money. But the point is, look at the impact it left on me as somebody who was young, just joined the bank, who could go up to my boss's boss and tell them that I had made a mistake and not get kicked for it, right? So that was just when I was very young. But through my career, with many people, our bosses would say that, look, if you make a mistake and you come and own up to it, it's okay, because mistakes will happen. But if you are intentionally doing something fraudulent, then that's a problem and you will get, obviously you will suffer for it, and fairly so. So I think that culture of saying that genuine mistakes are okay is a culture you need to have in the organization to have risk appetite. The other two things is, I think, as I've been thinking about this whole risk appetite issue, because we get asked that question so often, is you have to have a culture of risk appetite, you have to define the no-nos. So what will you not take a risk on? So, for instance, in a food company, you might say that, look, however interesting a particular product is, however successful a competitor's product is, if it is fundamentally unhealthy, I'm not going to do it, because I want to stand for products which are good for the consumer and healthy. So define a set of no-nos, and those will be different for different businesses. But if you don't define those, then you don't define the space that you're going to play in, the space that you're going to innovate in. So I think that is an essential element to create risk appetite. The third I think is useful is, you don't want to bet the bank, right? So you want to take risk, but you want to take risk which will, you still have the capacity to deal with. So maybe set aside a portion of your profits to innovate and maybe come up with a product which is going to disrupt some of your core stuff. But as long as you can define some of that, I think you help to promote risk culture. Yeah. Yes, Mr. Damodaran.
Just two thoughts arising out of what Niranjan said. The first is what a philosopher said many years ago, that when one is on one's deathbed and your whole life plays out as a movie before you call it a day, what you regret the most are the risks you did not take. Because you can't apply a what-if situation at that time. Had I done this, because the other is straight from Alice in Wonderland. Not to move forward is to move back. If you stay where you are, the rest of the world will go on. You have to keep taking those decisions and those risks.
Absolutely. So are there any more questions, or should we give back time to the audience? Looks like we're done, so we can give back 6 minutes.
Thank you.
Not bad.
But thank you.
Yeah. Good.
Thank you very much for really timing that so well. If I could please request the former MD and Chairman of LIC, Mr. Thomas Matthew, to please come up and present tokens of appreciation to our panelists. So once again, we've got caricatures of each of our panelists, as well as a certificate stating that 10 trees have been planted on your name in the Sundarbans. That's our panel with their caricatures and Mr. Thomas Matthew.